All right, so part one is called Variety is Perfect, and that title comes out of a quote by Swedenborg that I want to pull up on the screen right now and take a look at. This is from Heaven and Hell. We can see from the natural world as though in a mirror how perfection stems from variety in heaven as well, since things that happen in the natural world offer us a reflection of things in the spiritual world. So Swedenborg is saying this comes up a lot in different parts of his written material, this idea that to have a complete whole, you need to have a variety of elements going into it. And the greater the variety, the more perfect the whole can be. And so it seems like he's saying that shows up in spirituality and in nature and ecology. So Lincoln, you do a lot of work, out in the field with ecological systems and all that. And how do you see variety showing up as a key component of that?
Well, I guess one of the most striking contrasts you can see that illustrates it is to walk from a cornfield into the forest next to the cornfield.
Right.
And, of course, cornfield is a vast block of just a single species growing, and then in the forest you have just this enormous diversity and richness, and you almost feel it even before you understand it. You can just walk into a forest and feel uplifted and refreshed, but what makes that happen, I think, in large part, is the vast array of different species working together, filling different niches, performing different functions.
Yeah, and you kind of see people definitely feel something when they hit nature, and it's as close to a natural state as they can. People seem to have a greater and greater connection to it, and I think you're right that part of it is this. There's so much going on. There's complexity here at play, and it also so the more species that are in an ecosystem, the healthier that ecosystem is.
Yeah, that's a pretty core tenet of at least ecology as we currently practice it, trying to understand the natural world. Yeah.
And so, how do you see? So what is Swedenborg talking about when he's saying there needs to be this variety on a spiritual level as well, or how do you see that?
Yeah, well, I love how Swedenborg relates everything in the natural world to people's spiritual lives and people's spiritual communities of people. And I think if you look at a forest ecosystem with tall oaks and fruiting trees underneath the oaks that are smaller, and then vines growing up, and in a lot of cases working very harmoniously together, that can be an image of the way a human community can work. If we're working well together, we're each doing our job and complementing what else is going on. I love it. Like in the forest, just to take an example of the forest, there's plants in the forest that come up in the very early spring, and they're really tiny for the most part. Spring ephemerals. They're out there catching sunshine. And living their lives before the oak trees overhead or whatever else even puts their leaves on. So they're interesting themselves, if you could put it in human terms, interesting themselves in something that the other members of that community aren't doing. So the oak tree and the ephemerals underneath it work very well together. They're not, in fact, they each need each other in different ways, and it's very similar to the way different people have different passions and different spiritual callings to serve the greater community.
Yeah, that's a great point. I was just talking to someone recently who was thinking about what fields would you go into of work, and there are certain fields that are much less crowded because very few people want to have to do them. And so if there weren't people who with a passion for that or a willingness to do it, you'd have this unserved need in society, and the whole thing would suffer. And you kind of get a little bit of that with the way these different plants are taking advantage of the different kinds of sunlight. And so Swedenborg talks about how in the spiritual world there are these communities where everything is sewn together in that kind of harmony, but also inside a human being. That he says trees, plants, these kinds of things are images of what he would call our affections or our intentions, thoughts, that they're acting in the forest the same way our different thoughts and feelings are acting within us. And it's just interesting, and perhaps we sense some of that we're looking at us when we go out there, and we can learn something even if we're not totally aware of it.
Yeah, definitely, and we relate to the trees and the animals that we see, and I think part of the reason there's a connection or a resemblance is that we all ultimately come from the same source. There is a creative force in the universe, can look at as God, and so some of that life flows into the trees, some of it flows into the butterflies and other animals, and some of it flows into us. So there's that connection naturally, and we can learn things about ourselves from being students of it.
Certainly, and that's another way that variety shows up in the Swedenborg does talk about. Emanating from the divine is this force, but everybody receives it in a different way. It receives it according to their form, and he likens it to the sun. That on the physical plane, the sun's light and heat, flow into all kinds of different plants, but they sprout up according to their form. It can be very different, even though it's all receiving the same solar energy. So that's a great point. And diversity shows up all over the place in nature, even within populations. The more genetic diversity there is, all that kind of stuff creates this more happy, healthy whole.